give a shout out to my fellow OWASP Los Angeles board members. We've got a great team: Arian, Anil, Edmund, Cassio, Dave, and myself. Initially, it was a huge challenge when the pandemic started, but we've settled in to our monthly virtual existence. And we do miss those in-person meetings, and hopefully we can get those back up in 2021 at some point. But for now, we'll have to do it this way. And let's continue to have some dialogue. I'd like to see some more Zoom and other type of platform informal meetings with people. I know I hold one. People should be doing that more often to stay sane. There's my advice for the day. A little bit about us. Who are we? We've got over 2,100 meetup members in our OWASP Los Angeles meetup, which is great. We were one of the original host chapters of AppSec California. And we're a really good community. The networking has been outstanding. Everyone helps each other, because at work, trying to solve every problem on your own is not a recipe for success. And we typically used to meet on the same day, but for dinner, and we'd have a whole bunch of us in person. And the one good thing about the virtual world, we can now have world famous speakers from anywhere without worrying about if they can come out here and the time difference and everything. So I think that's about the only good thing, but at least we're taking advantage of it. We've had an amazing array of speakers, and we have a great one today as well. Something about OWASP itself, for those of you who are not familiar with OWASP, it's a worldwide organization with chapters around the world. It's a free and open community. The goal, of course, is to make software secure and visible, to teach the developers how to code securely by providing tons of resources. There are 189 free resources. We call them projects, but people have spent countless hours developing free standards and checklists and cheat sheets and frameworks to help developers and security specialists work together towards a better world with less backdoors for the black hat hackers. The most famous, of course, is the OWASP Top 10, which analyzes and provides information on the greatest security risks. But my favorite, I think, is ZAP, which is a free pen testing tool, but also it's application and security testing. It has a lot of capabilities. Takes a little bit of learning up front, but if you compare it to how much you have to pay in the real world, it's something that's quite remarkable. There's an ASVS is the application security verification standard, which really provides direction of how to test and how to provide a good secure coding atmosphere. We are up to, I believe the latest count, it is dynamic, 207 chapters in 56 countries and counting. So we are indeed global. A little bit about our next meeting. Again, we're always on the fourth Wednesday, lunchtime. We've got Daniel Lehman. He'll be talking about binary security and WebAssembly. So hopefully those of you who like the more detailed presentations, you'll love this one. And big thanks to Cassio, who's been providing wonderful speakers for us for several years. That's really outstanding. His knowledge and connection in the field are much appreciated. Please do connect with us other than just on this meetup. We do have LinkedIn and Facebook presence and Twitter and even Instagram for you youngsters. Yeah. So please do consider joining us. Let me leave this up for a moment, but you can just search for us. You should be able to find it. I'm not sure why we have the underscore for Instagram, but it's there. So please take a look. But Twitter and LinkedIn are our main focus. So please do join us, join the discussion. Please contribute and make some posts of your own to help engage the community. And other vendors who might be watching, you saw what we can do for you, and we can help you find more people and partner with some potential future customers. So let us know, sponsorship.la@owasp.org. Send us an email. We'll be happy to work with you. We're pretty flexible, particularly now during our sequestration. Don't forget, you're almost out of time, but there are a couple of days left. If you are a member, it's too late to join and vote now. But if you are a member and have not voted, exercise your right to vote. It's very important. And we thoroughly endorse Haral Tsitsivas, who was the co-chair with me for AppSec California. He heads up the Orange County OWASP chapter, and he's a great supporter of chapter and member rights for OWASP. Those are being threatened. So I encourage you to support him and cast your vote for him. Don't forget, I've had this slide up for many meetings because we just loved Alex's presentation at AppSec Cali in January. We kind of just squeezed that in before we had a lockdown. But there's tons of talks, all the talks actually. We recorded every session. They're on YouTube. Go to our YouTube site and you can catch up now. While you're not spending all that time driving to work, you have extra time, right? So catch up and see what you could find. And now finally we can get to why you've joined us today. We get to hear from Curtis Yanko, who's the senior principal architect at Sonatype, and he's going to give us a talk. I'm going to turn things over to you, Curtis. I want to thank you for joining us. I hope the drive wasn't too bad.
Thank you, Richard. Let me share my screen. And how does that look? Can we see that?
Looks good.
All right, excellent. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you for that introduction, Richard. I'm not sure I qualify as a world famous speaker, but I have been involved. I have been a DevSecOps evangelist and coach. Let me just get to this. For about the last 12 or so years, really started as an app dev and delivery guy in some Fortune 100 insurance companies here in the Connecticut area where I am. But I about 6 years ago jumped at the chance to join Sonatype because it allowed me to sort of follow my passion to help those stodgy old companies get better and faster, right? And so I felt like I was able to push one rock up one hill at one company. And then I thought in the vendor seat, it would be easier for me to help lots of folks push lots of rocks up lots of hills. So with that, let's move on. So I got to kind of get used to this format. What we're going to talk about today underpins in the idea that we all have software supply chains. This probably isn't that new, something that we at Sonatype have been talking about for the last 6 years or so. But the thing is, when we start to analyze the performance and security of open source components that are being used in development and what it takes to make it easier, we realize that it's very, very similar to manufacturing, and that there's a lot of lessons that we can learn for that. And so a lot of what we talk about is really based on the same revolution that we saw in the manufacturing industry from decades previous. And it's really about going faster and improving quality, right? But why supply chains are such an important aspect of that. So our premise throughout today is faster is better. It's better for the enterprise. And I think you'll see it's really better for everyone, including people we wish it wasn't better for. But that's what we're going to drive. And we know this to be true. And this is one of the things that's really changed in the 12 years since I've been involved. And really even in the last 5 or 6 years, the dramatic change has been that we've been able to go from this idea that we all were pretty sure it was better, but now we can quantify it, right? So for the last several years, Nicole Forsgren has been working on the State of DevOps report. I'm sure a lot of folks are familiar with that. And so they've taken the time to actually quantify that high-performing IT organizations can, in fact, generate company benefit, improve revenue, all these sorts of things that for the longest time, most researchers of this type of data would tell you that you couldn't get any benefit from IT, that anything you did in IT, your competitors could do too, and you could never really gain a competitive advantage. But what we're learning is it's less about the technology, it's more about the people. Having said that, there are some real empirical advantages to the things that those technologies can do for us. And so we know for a fact now that faster is better. And here's some of the findings that we see. I've followed the State of the DevOps report since its very first year. I think it was in the second or third year. So I don't know if it was the 2015 or 2016. And if you look closely at my opening picture, I was at DevOps Enterprise Summit 2015. My first year as a vendor. I had attended the year before as a customer. But this is the 4 major categories that if you're starting on this journey, you're going to look at if you looked at this report, which is your deployment frequency, lead time, right? Time to recovery, and change failure rate. So these are sort of the 4 really high level metrics that people use. And this is the kind of stuff the State of the DevOps report shows us, that the high performers are just really much better at this than other folks, right? But it also reminds me, as we talk about this, I do want to take 1 second and just reflect upon the fact that we do have to be aware of the proxies. Let me move there we go, that's a little better. Processes become proxies for the outcomes that we want. And we have to be really careful about this because we start to focus on them and we think that they are the result that we want, but they're really not. They enable us to get the results we want to our customers. So as we go through this, I just want to keep in the back of everyone's mind that the process is not always the thing, right? It's always sort of worth asking, do we own our processes or do our processes own us? And I think that's a constant thing that we have to ask ourselves as we're constantly evolving, adding processes and doing these things. It's easy to get distracted by them. So just a brief aside to keep that in mind. I don't want to lose sight of that. Oh, what happened now? Now I'm not clicking over here. But we're here talking about security because there's adversaries, right? Without adversaries, we wouldn't have this problem. We would just all release code really fast and we wouldn't worry about a lot of things. But because there's adversaries, security is very important. Unfortunately, faster is better for adversaries as well. And that's what I hinted at earlier. So while we're all trying to go faster, guess what? So are they. And I actually often joke that our adversaries are doing a better job of implementing DevOps than most of the rest of us, which is kind of sad. And in fact, we'll take a look at a couple examples that sort of demonstrate that. The first one, without belaboring it, is the well-known infamous attack on Equifax. But the key takeaways from this are that, so it goes through this period of responsibility, patches are made available, everyone does the right thing, notifications go out. But a day later, after that announcement, which gives you an idea how quickly these things can be weaponized. So when the National Vulnerability Database or F-Secure or someone says, hey, we're confident that people can turn this into an effective exploit quickly, they mean it. That same year, I think it was, someone at the NSA talking at like a Black Hat conference was sharing their stories about how they routinely get attacked within 24 hours of new vulnerabilities going out there. And obviously some of the prime ones, not any and every vulnerability, but the big ones, those remote code executions, the ones that sort of can lead to ownership, right? So sometimes it's a combination of things. Equifax itself got hit within 3 days. Right. So this is the key here, is that they're really fast at doing this. Right. So faster is better for them. Here's another one on the salt stack thing. Again, you have this big coordinated disclosure. You go, things are put out, patches are made, notifications are put out. And I think there was a quote even from someone saying that I think it was F-Secure made this quote that said, and this came out on a Wednesday. So I think if we look at like I think April 29th was a Wednesday, and F-Secure kind of said, like, if you don't patch by Friday, you will be compromised by Monday. Well, guess what? May 2nd was a Saturday. So they were right. So the folks that didn't patch, which was most, we're starting to see attacks. You could see here messages from GitHub accounts and stuff. This is an eye chart. We don't have to cover it. We'll make sure, I'm sure we'll find a way to get this deck out to people so that you can look at this more closely. But again, the point is faster is better for them because they are generally faster at weaponizing attacks than we are in putting compensating controls, patches, or anything like that in place. I think, oh, right, I wanted to draw the F-15. The other numbers I wanted to draw is this. This is the part that's most disturbing to me. is this is everybody doing everything right. There's lots of disclosure. There's lots of public announcements, right? These are not ones that are flying under the radar that don't get reported into the vulnerability database. There was 6,000 publicly exposed servers. And I think if we fast forward to May, there was still like almost half of them were still publicly exposed, despite explicit warnings saying don't do that and patch and all this sort of stuff. So this is the part that frustrates me personally a lot, because I feel like we have a lot of people doing a lot of hard work to do the right thing to get the word out. And then it just tends to fall on deaf ears, or people that, maybe feel that they just have other more important things to do. I don't know. Drives me a little bit nuts. We at Sonatype have been tracking this in our DevSecOps community survey over the last several years. And what you see here is a little interesting in that 2018, so really that was about the 2017, you're really getting data on the year before. Sorry about that. Um, 2018 saw the big spike because that was the year after Equifax. And so, but what we've seen since then is we definitely have noticed that there's been an increase in investment post Equifax. And so now you start to see the numbers trending down, because we are starting to take this more seriously and making, in some cases, it's shifting security budget away from traditional perimeter and sort of traditional concerns, and started moving it into the AppSec space, which is probably woefully underfunded if we took a close look at those numbers. AppSec spend is a very small spend relative to the overall security spend. There's probably a lot of other reasons for that I'm not privy to, but it does seem out of proportion, and it seems like we would do better to change it. But so we are seeing increasing investment, but at the same time, as we continue to survey folks, and this is from this year's State of the Software Supply Chain report, so you're sort of getting, there's a latency there of what people are answering sort of relative to many months earlier. It takes us a long time to pull these reports together. But the big thing we see here is that over half the companies out there take a week or to never to patch, right? So a week or more. So we're still not there, right? So we still got this 3 days, and now we got a week. So you're almost there. And if I do the math on the other side, I've got probably about 40 some odd % that have a fighting chance, right? That 35% group's right on the cusp, but let's just say they all make it, right? They're all good. We got about 40, the 49% that's getting it done, but we still have the 51% that's really at risk because it's just taking too long to do this. So that's sort of a classic and historical view of that. But the adversaries, just like us, are continuing to innovate. They're continuing to find more efficient ways to bring their stuff to market, if you will, for lack of a better term. And so what we see, and we've been tracking this for a few years now, is down at the bottom here, we have what we call we're referring to downstream legacy attacks. These are wait and pray attacks, right? You wait for the vulnerability to happen and then you prey upon it, right? But the thing is, you're sort of waiting. You have to, the right things have to be out there. They have to be in modules that are very well known or very popular, have large user bases. And it's just inefficient for them, right? So they're not in control. They're much more reactionary. So a lot like us, they're probably thinking, what do we got to do to be more proactive so that we can steal more money and do more harm? And so what we're starting to see is a shift to upstream next generation attacks. Let's just talk a little bit about what that amounts to. This is a study that came out of the University of Darmstadt in Germany, that we borrowed these numbers because they shed some light on some things. So if you were an adversary and you were thinking like, how am I going to go poison the well and pollute some projects? Obviously you go to GitHub and you maybe try to earn some trust and make some commits, and then sneak your stuff in, and hopefully it gets by the pull request. But more importantly, what you would want to do is you might focus on one of these 5 projects, right? So the top 5 NPM packages, while they're super popular in and of themselves and downloaded a lot, they're used in over 150,000 applications, right? So if you can touch any one of those apps and infect it, you can get a pretty big reach all of a sudden, right? So we see this type of attacks where malicious code is being injected into projects like these. I'm not saying these are the ones, but it just gives you an idea in this ecosystem that between those 5 projects, or if you could sort of buddy up with some of the 100 most influential maintainers and start to, work on their projects, that you're starting to get access to over 50% of all the apps and stuff or projects that are being delivered out there. So you've got ways to really get at this, certainly in the NPM ecosystem. Just about 2 years ago, we really started tracking this and collecting the data. And then we, of course, backfilled the data all the way back to where we started collecting data in general. We were able to sort of do that. And so if we look from like March of 2015 all the way up to June of 2019, there was like a total of 216 of these typo squatting, malicious code injection, these basically what we call poison the well next generation attacks. And then right after we published the State of the Software Supply Chain report, we started to see a big uptick. And then it flattened out. And then we saw another major spike where we get, I can't see my number here now, but it's something like another 929 over that next period. So we're seeing a rapid increase in this. And we continue to believe that this is in response to, we are continuing to get better at our devs going faster, at our security practices getting better, and we're making investments in those space. So they're seeing this as a more efficient, richer opportunity to bring their attacks to bear. This is an eye chart. I'm not going to cover this at all. You guys can look at this, but this is what we've been chronicling over the last couple of years in the State of Supply Chain report. It's just gotten bigger each year. This is something that we update on an ongoing basis internally at Sonatype as we just continue to track and map these. But early on, what we did is, and what I've done here, I should say, is I'm just going to take a handful of them and summarize, because I think they do a good job of painting the picture of the landscape and also sort of the evolution of some of this. And back in March of 2018, we noticed NPM projects that were trying to steal credentials. And this really got our attention. Our CTO, Brian Fox, and co-founder immediately latched onto this and said, this ain't good, because the credentials aren't the thing they want. They want them to go do something else, right? That it's a means to an end. And so we knew that this was a harbinger of worse things to come. In June 2019, we're still seeing throughout this whole period, there's just a pattern of a lot of password stealing, credential stealing, that kind of stuff that had been going on. And we knew that it was the intent was to then go back and pollute those projects, but maybe falsifying who you are, trying to look like you're the maintainer, trying to look like you're a well-known contributor. And so in June of 2019, you end up with 23 Ruby gem packages that got pulled because these things were infected with a variety of things, right? So in June, there was a mixture of crypto mining and password and credential stealing. So there's more password credential stealing, but also we start to see the infusion of crypto mining or things trying to steal cryptocurrency, which that brings us to June. So now we're starting to see this was an attempt at stealing like $13 million in cryptocurrency through this NPM package, right? So that sort of got found out and documented. By 2019, we're starting to see backdoors being put into PyPI projects. And then the most recent one earlier this year was the Octopus scanner. I'm sure a lot of folks in this group are aware of that. But that looked like a next generation attack to us, because this was bizarre in that the nature of the attack was getting the project's NetBeans configuration to get NetBeans itself to inject and replicate the malicious code. So this was not necessarily the adversaries directly injecting. They were tool tampering, as we're putting it. So they're getting the tools tampered so that the tools start doing it for them and replicating that process. So that just brings us through all of that. So that's the bad guys getting faster. But the good news is our developers are getting faster too. So let's focus back on these guys a bit. And we know they're getting faster because we can see things like this. This is the weekly rolling average of downloads of NPM for the last several years. But the only number that matters is on the chart on the right, the 22.5 billion downloads. That's an awful lot of things. And if we annualize that, you're looking at 1.14 trillion downloads. I don't know how many people here or anywhere thought there was 1.14 trillion things of anything being downloaded somewhere, but here you have it. I mean, it's obviously, you know, for folks that know NPM, it's a big ecosystem. When you get one component, you get lots of components. So there's a lot of reasons for this and the nature of it. But we know that developers are leveraging these packages, which is great. You know, this is what we want them to do because open source represents a lot of tremendous value. If we flip over to what we're more familiar with here at Sonatype and take a look at the central repository, I believe in 2019, we had 226 billion downloads, give or take. But so far we've been looking at the data this year, and if we extrapolate it and project it out, which admittedly we did a little while ago, and I don't know if anybody's updated it, but the point being is we're looking at roughly 370 billion or so. So we continue to see this near logarithmic growth in download requests. And we also know there's only about 10 million Java developers on the planet. So, you know, when you start to do that division, you realize there's just a massive amount of consumption taking place. We also analyzed over 1,700 different applications, mostly via our customers using our tooling. So we sort of have that insight. And we know that on average, apps are made up about 90% of these third-party components, right? These open source components to us look like the suppliers of screws and bolts and brake pads and airbags that the automobile industry has. And, you know, if you're a car manufacturer, you don't need to be reinventing all those wheels. People do that. So you source them. And all this, you know, and all this open source comes with a ton of benefit in driving innovation, allows us to be productive, allows us to go fast. So that, you know, I don't want to send the wrong message. There's a lot of positives that come out of this. And the fact that we can do this today is amazing, because early in my career, we were writing, you know, a CAD/CAM program in C++, and we owned a couple commercial libraries, and that was it. Like everything else we wrote, right? So we've come a long way from that. But this also then dovetails into that same 2015 picture I showed at the beginning at DevOps Enterprise Summit. Was right about the time I had become acquainted with John Willis. We, as a vendor, I started attending a lot of DevOps days. I'm at the Enterprise Summit. I'm at OWASP meetups. You know, wherever I can go and spread the good word, we're out there. And John Willis and I were on similar circuits for a while and traveled together. And even at some point got to do some security workshops together called You Build It, You Secure It, that we did out in Vegas and some other places. But what was interesting is he was the only person back then that was talking about Edwards Deming, right? So he was the one that said, look, you know, this has definitely become just like a manufacturing process. The difference being is we don't really have visibility into our supply chains at that time, right? So at that time, very few people had any real visibility into their supply chains. And he started talking about this, and it was the Deming's principles, the same things that drove the automobile industry and Toyota really to just start taking away lots of US market share as they cranked out cheap, I shouldn't say cheap, affordable yet reliable vehicles that people gravitated to. You know, why wouldn't you? They didn't cost you an arm and a leg, and they tended to just keep running, and that's what people mostly really want out of their vehicles. But so he started talking about we have to build quality and you can't test it in, right? All these Deming's type of concepts. Also talked about really like we need to be very selective about which open source projects we're using. We want to just really use the best project, and we should limit the number of projects that we use. And even within a project, we should limit the number of versions that we're using, right? We really want to shrink down that attack surface and do that Toyota thing of really working with the vendors to make sure that what they're delivering is of the highest quality for you. And we can, of course, do that in the software world because these are all open source components. We can go contribute. We can make changes, add features, improve performance. We can do whatever we feel we need that component to do for us that it doesn't do today so that we can deliver better products ourselves. So faster is better for developers, but is it also better for open source? So as we started looking at open source and I think I changed the, yeah, I did. I apologize. I got these out of order at the last minute because like I talked to Richard and them, who doesn't futz with their deck up to the last minute, and I confused myself and thought I had my narrative out of order. But starting a couple of years ago, we partnered up with Gene Kim and Dr. Stephen McGill here. Gene Kim, of course, is best known for the Phoenix Project and the Unicorn and all of his work now in the community. Dr. Stephen McGill being the CEO at MuseDev, but we partnered up with the two of them and wanted to get some of that, analytical insight that Dr. Forsgren and Gene Kim and Jez Humble brought to the State of the DevOps report. We wanted that level of analytics and insights into the stuff we were doing. So we partnered up with them to start really digging through our data and understanding, how does this translate into open source projects? And so while in the enterprise earlier, we talked about we can look at things like deployment frequency, organizational performance, mean time to restore, change failures, whatever. What we did find is there are stuff that has corollaries into the open source world, which again, of course, is release frequency, their deployment frequency. Popularity can be a bit of a proxy, although we'll see maybe not all the time. But maybe the most important one of all of them is time to remediate vulnerabilities, right? So the other two aren't so important as long as you're fixing things fast. And that starts to become the criteria by which we're judging. I mean, think about it. If you were doing a physical supplier and there's a recall on those airbags, you would hope that that company could provide you with a better fixed version of that airbag quickly, right? You don't want to have to wait for a better airbag so that you can keep putting cars out the end of your assembly line. So this, it becomes one of the more critical metrics in this space. And so from that, we sort of devised what we call an interview process, but really it was a data analytics process. But it allowed us to effectively sort of interview 24,000 open source projects by just measuring them along these various attributes. Again, their average daily downloads from Central or from wherever they are. Although this might have been focused on the Java ecosystem. This particular bit of data might have focused specifically on Java. The size of the team, the development speed, the release speed, right? And we got down to the last two where security and update speed. What we found is the way to measure these is a little bit more complicated, right? But we know we want to measure it, but it's just, it's a little bit more nuanced than something we can put on one line here. And we had a couple of hypotheses as we went into this. The first being that projects that release frequently have better outcomes. And we were able to validate that hypothesis. And we were able to show that I think the threshold was somewhere around 4 releases a year or more, right? So the projects that had higher release frequencies tended to be more popular, first off. They tended to have larger development teams. And there was definitely this, a small percentage of them, but it seemed to be somewhat unique to this higher releasing group, tended to have foundational support. So think things like Spring. Our second hypothesis was that projects that updated their dependencies more frequently, and this is kind of meta because I'm going to tell you to update your dependencies, but guess what? They have the same problem and we can't always update their dependencies for them. So the projects that are doing that were generally more secure. That was our hypotheses. That, of course, was validated when we looked through the data. And we saw that not only did they have more frequent releases in terms of, because they were updating their dependencies, right? So that's sort of a forcing function of the release in many cases. They were also 530 times faster than median to update and 173 times less likely to have I think that's supposed to be out of date dependencies, not out of data dependencies. I did make this slide just as a caveat there. But so it seems like faster is better for open source projects. And what we learned though is when we start to really look at this data and tease it out, most projects stay secure by staying up to date, right? That's the simple bottom line up front. But not every project has a known vulnerability. So we also looked at update times, right? So, because updating is just a cultural thing, whether or not it has to do with security or just any other general quality defect is almost irrelevant. So you just really want to look at update times in general. And what we found was that 55% of these projects out there have an MTTR and an MTTU within about 20% of each other. So that's, measuring that gap, and that's a pretty tight gap. Only about 15% though maintain better than average mean time to remediate, with worse than average mean time to update. Right, so those are the tail ends. But what we do see here that high performing teams, faster is better, both for new features and quality, which encompasses security. So a third hypothesis that we had, project with fewer dependencies will stay more up to date, right? It should be a lot simpler if you only have 25 dependencies as opposed to 150 dependencies. You got a lot less to manage. But it turns out that's not necessarily the case. There actually seemed to be a correlation that projects with more dependencies had better MTTU, right? So open source projects had actually better mean time to update, maybe partially because they were more sensitive to it, because there was more there. It's not exactly clear the motivation. Also, more popular projects would be better about staying up to date, right? The ones that are being downloaded the most, used the most, but that also got rejected. There are plenty of popular projects out there with poor mean time to update numbers, so there's not a correlation there. When we a little bit closer look about projects with fewer dependencies and trying to validate that, if you only had 1 or 2 dependencies, it should be pretty easy to keep them up to date with the latest version, right? Certainly easier than if you had 10 or 15, like I said, if you got 25 versus 150. But what we found was a bit of the opposite. And what we realized is, if we looked at these team sizes, right? So you have the team size on the left and the number of dependencies on the right. What we found is that 2 pizza teams tended to outperform 1 pizza teams. So this was interesting. So as that team size got to the point to about a 2 pizza team, and maybe it's just because you just have enough people to address more concerns versus the 1 pizza team has to be more focused. Again, I don't want to read too much into the causation, but the data started to tease out this, and was just an interesting finding that these larger development teams, these 2 pizza teams, were about 50% faster at mean time to update and released about 2.6 times more frequently. Right. So again, I think it's a little bit of we're right in the sweet spot of having the right amount of resources without having too many or too few. Right. As you get too many, a different type of tyranny kicks in that slows you down. Just the scale of communicating with your peers. Right. But that brings us to the next part. Got to catch up here. So to bring all this together, when we just looked at a lot of that data, we pulled it together into a scatter plot. And, so what you're seeing here is you want projects with high quality, right? So we have release frequency on the bottom, where the most frequent is to the left and the less frequent releases seldomly is to the right. So it's average days between, right? So you want a small number there. Combined against their popularity, in this case from Maven Central, the central repo. When we started just scatter plotting this, we start to see some things here where, we see that popularity trends up as release speed increases, but exemplars tend to be more popular, right? So these projects in blue were our large projects that were exemplar projects, which is to say they had really good MTTR, MTTU, release frequency, right? The things that we talked about interviewing and analyzing, those were the really, really good projects. We also then come up with a category of feature first projects. So these seem to be projects that are interested in pushing out new features, but aren't necessarily good at fixing old problems. So they still tend to be popular despite the fact that they don't necessarily update it as frequently as they should. And then we found a lot of laggards and again, this sort of supports, there's very popular projects here across that are from exemplars to feature first to laggards, and even in the cautious community that all are popular, but they don't necessarily all translate into that we would expect or need. So what we're saying is, you want to avoid these suppliers. Yeah, they're popular. Their update frequency is probably not great, but it probably isn't bad if you're on the left side of that box. But as you get to the right, then the release frequency alone is probably starting to become a pretty good indicator that they're not going to be a top project, right? You don't see any blue dots with really slow release frequencies, right? Although there is a couple of small exemplars out there. If you look, there's a couple of green dots out there. So when we think about the kind of guidance we can provide for an open source project, we want them to be very similar to what we're trying to accomplish in our organizations. We want them to focus on accelerating and maintaining rapid mean time to updates, right? We want them very proactively patching and updating their dependencies and applying fixes to their projects. We want you to commit a resource to dependency management. And maybe that's why a 2-pizza team can outperform, because once you get to a 2-pizza team, you can have a couple specialists on each team, but you end up with, twice as many specialists across the whole team as you would on a single team, right? So it's hard to carve out these little concerns that sort of tend to be taken on by one individual on the team, or even the one individual is championing it and raising it in meetings. When they are adding a new dependency, they should be thinking about those dependencies as a choice, as a strategic choice. We'll take a closer look at some of the data about that. But, that's the sort of stuff that we want them to look at too, is we want them to have information that guides their choice so they can make better choices about their dependencies and not get stuck with things that aren't being updated, that aren't being fixed. And then it becomes really hard sometimes to get off of those, right? So you almost learn too late, and then you're kind of stuck with them until you go through some major refactoring. Aim for a minimum of 4 releases annually. That's why I mentioned this number earlier. It does seem to be about the tipping point. If you're releasing quarterly, that's the beginning of a fast enough cadence that you can start to be on top of this issue. Obviously, I think that's just the beginning. I think I think the average project can release 10 to 12 times a year. But once you dip below this, that's a huge indicator that project is not going to be a high quality project. So that's something they can look for, and it's something we want them to do. And they should be looking to upgrade at least 80% of their dependencies with every release. I think this is 80% comes from like an 80-20 mindset. I don't think there's hard empiricism there, so take it with a grain of salt. But the point being is you should really be looking across all of your dependencies and updating the ones that have updates available, especially those patch releases, right? I like to joke that they patch that software for a reason. And if I don't put it in my app, my customers are going to find out why, right? They're going to tell me why they patch their software, because they're going to find the bug in my software. And it's going to be on us. I can't blame it on anyone else, right? So we have to take that. So this is the kind of guidance we would provide to open source projects to improve the quality of the parts that they're supplying to the rest of us. When we talk about updating the projects, we have 3 sample projects here. We've been looking into the ideas of breaking changes, breaking API changes, all this stuff with the work that we're doing. And so we in doing that data, we started looking at all these different upgrade paths and charts, again, based on stuff that we're seeing from our customers when we see them try to do this. Without getting too heavily into this is Hibernate. If you just try not to look too close, what you see is basically 2 big bubbles. I think you're looking at Hibernate 3 and Hibernate 4. We called them booms. It looks like the Hibernate 3 world, upgrading even within it, was more problematic. It seems like Hibernate 4 has done a better job. We see a lot more blue and a lot more that almost this very, you can't see, but in the lower right, you start to see this pattern of like every other version jumping some number of version, and it starts to form almost like a moire pattern or something there. You start to see that pop out. That's just a really good indicator that it's relatively easy to patch. People are patching successfully and updating successfully. And so you start to see more lines like that. This is the Spring framework. Spring framework can be really hard. We can see there's lots and lots of jumps. I don't know what versions this is across, if this is across a major version boundary or not. This is a bit of an eye chart and a mess, but my broad stroke takeaway from this is it has gotten better. It feels like we're learning and we're not making the same mistakes. It looks like there was a lot of red in upgrade attempts, both short and long, if you go in the earlier versions. And then as I look over to the right, I see a mixture of relatively long and then increasingly shorter upgrades, almost all of which are successful. So it looks like the projects are improving on this. Here's a great one. This starts to really show that pattern. This is Jota time, super easy to migrate. It's hard to find red lines in here of upgrade paths that didn't work. So what you see is lots of upgrades from versions to next versions to bigger versions. So you just see it all across the map here. But that's great news, because that just means regardless of where we are, when it's our turn to upgrade, it's going to be relatively easy and we're not going to be stuck, right? And that's what can happen with a lot of these, is you're sitting on a known vulnerable component. There's and it's hard to get off of, right? The upgrade path available to you isn't as simple as changing a version number. And that's when we start to get in trouble. So our guidance for enterprise development. The open source projects that we choose to put into our apps, many of which are our crown jewels, many of which are, nobody would deny that the applications that companies are writing are strategic to them. They're the primary way that we deliver value to our customers now. They're the primary way that we differentiate our business and add value. But we have to apply that same strategic thinking to our choices in the open source components we use, right? We got to start I know they're free. I know they're easy to get, but that doesn't mean you should just grab something, right? These things can be really important to you. And so you really want to start really having a program in place that lets you have criteria by which you choose these things, because it is such a strategic decision and it can have a lot of impact down the line. So I mentioned implement selection criteria. One of the things we notice in some of the that's going to come up a little bit later, but you'll see there's teams that have really fast ability to approve open source components, but it turns out they do that because they have no criteria. Anyone can use anything, right? But there definitely should be some criteria around what you're going to use and why. And obviously security is a factor and licensing a factor, but there's other factors. There's technical factors, but also, ease of training and onboarding, what you already know, but again, treating it strategically. MTTU should probably be as important a metric as anything on these. If I had one thing to measure these by, I would look at projects. I don't care if it's a small project. I don't care if they only release 4 times a year. If they're finding and fixing things in a reasonable amount of time, that's the same expectation I have on myself and our teams. So I expect that of them. And that would be probably the single most important metric I would gravitate towards. That selection criteria is part of a formalized procurement process, but it has to work at the speed of dev, right? It can't be this sort of thing that you open a ticket and you wait weeks. That doesn't work for anybody except the people approving tickets. And I'm not sure it works for them, to be honest. And then we want to minimize that variability. This is the John Willis stuff and Demings, right? We want to limit the number of suppliers we have, and then we want to limit the number of parts that we get from those suppliers. So for us, that means less open source projects and less versions of those projects. Anecdotally, a story very early in my time with Sonatech, we met with a financial service company in New York. And when we did an analysis of what they had, we realized they had 81 of the 82 versions of Spring. And I flippantly joked, like, geez, you might as well just download that last one and collect them all. But then we went on to make the point, like, does it make sense to you that you're using every version of Spring? Does that sound reasonable? And of course, the answer is no, right? We know this intuitively. It's not the right approach. Google's really good. Google's always using one version, and then they use 2 versions, and then it goes back to 1 version. That's how Google operates. Now, we can't all be Google, but I think it's safe to say we could limit our numbers to 2, 3, or 4 versions and not 50, 60, or 80 versions. So is faster better for the enterprise, right? I mean, that's the next question is all this speed, and especially a lot of us have been around long enough that we think speed, the faster we go, we lose control, right? I'm an old SCM guy. That was the classic trade-off in software configuration management. I needed just enough control that I had control, but I didn't want to slow it down any more than I had to. So can we go faster in the enterprise? And then, we know from the DORA reports that faster is better. I talked about it earlier with the work that Nicole did. 200 times more frequent deployments. I'm sure the slow guys making that number big are really slow. 2.6 faster recovery, 7 times lower change failure rates. I'm an old deployment guy. I'm a huge fan of lower change failure rates because that just means my stuff's working. It's just deploying, and it means I'm not swarming and stealing resources to fix that. But the other key thing here is we also see time and time again now in the last couple of years that this also translates into happier employees, higher employee engagement, which also makes them more productive, people that want to come to work, right? Because they enjoy the environment that they're in, and they enjoy their coworkers, because why not? Who doesn't want to work with happy people? So, the other part of this is, we 1.75 times more likely to make extensive use of open source components. That's actually kind of interesting. So as you get good at it, you can even use more, right? So you start to, you can make more extensive use of it. And 1.5 times more likely to be expanding use of open source components. So those seem to go together. It's like, as you're going faster and you're doing this, and you're doing more and more builds and you're upgrading more and more frequently, you're going to be pulling down more and more versions. So I think the causality on this one's pretty straightforward. It's increased build frequency. If you're patching more often and doing these things and maintaining your dependencies, then you're going to start expanding your use of open source, at least across the volume and variety that we're seeing over time. So what does this look like to the average enterprise? So we know, as the stewards of Maven Central, that the average enterprise downloads about 373,000 components a year. What's interesting about that is you'll start to see the waste. There's a lot of waste here, mostly because a lot of these go directly to desktops and not through some sort of proxy cache that would then say that you download each thing once and not hundreds or thousands of times. But these companies are effectively using about 3,500 components, and then but across about 11,000 component release versions, right? So that suggests 3 to 4 versions per component. But we also know that about 8.3% of those that being downloaded probably have known vulnerabilities. And again, this sort of assumes you're not on the very latest of everything, not that that means less, but there's definitely this lag where a lot of people are on components that are months old to years old, and they're still downloading them. So we see this, that that we know that there's a sort of a flat rate percentage of known vulnerable components being downloaded on an ongoing basis. But so I guess the question is faster and more secure? So even though we know faster is better, is faster and more secure achievable in the enterprise, right? So that's really what we're trying to get to here. And I got bad news. The answer is no, it can't be done. I'm just kidding, actually. No, I think we've seen enough evidence to show that it does work in a lot of contexts, and it definitely works in this context as well, although there's still a lot of room for us to get better, right? So this is, again, from our surveys, about, I forget the numbers, like almost 700 orgs and asking developers these questions and the answers they got. Are we scheduling dependencies as part of our daily work? Less than 40%. Okay, it's a good start. We got a ways to go there. We strive to use the latest version or latest -n on all of our dependencies. This is 46%. 50% use some process to add a new dependency. Okay, 30% say yes to that they have a process to proactively remove problematic or unused dependencies. All right, that's all good. And we have automated tools to track and manage and ensure policy and compliance of our dependencies. Oh, and there, the sample number is 658. But we were a little concerned that, and this is a survey from a couple years ago, and we were a little concerned that a lot of this might be aspirational. We talked a lot about this in that survey because we asked people to self-identify if they were high performing or not. And there was a lot of aspects of that survey that felt aspirational, that felt like people were sort of projecting themselves maybe to be a little bit more than they really were. But when you ask a broad question, it's easy to answer until you get down into the specifics. And so we enhanced how we want to ask questions. We really drilled into this area in the new report for 2020, and we focused on these types of questions to get a much more granular look at what we thought, to get deeper into those earlier answers, right? So again, development philosophies, agile, waterfall, that sort of stuff, deployment frequency, are you using static analysis? Are you scheduling patching? Do you have a process to add OSS components? Do you have a process to remove OSS components? Do you have some OSS organization that's providing insight and enlightening people on what's out there to help make those better choices? Are you centralizing your asset management of these things? All these types of things. And so we went to 679 enterprises this time. We got a few more than the year before. And we took all that data and worked with Gene and Stephen again, and we came up with a scatter plot. And this to me was mind-blowing. This year, this bit of data was a real eye-opener to me. I thought it was just the best thing that came out of this report for a couple of reasons, and we'll touch on a few of them. But if I start in the lower left, so we got our purple dots down there. We're dubbing them the low performers. We're calling they're mostly waterfall. We don't want to be there, right? So they're not particularly getting great risk management outcomes, and they're not particularly efficient at delivering value. If I go over to the right, though, we get into what we sort of dub the DevOps community, and more accurately, a culture of productivity first. So based on how they're answering those questions, what we can tell is they're really focused on the going fast bit and delivering value. And to varying degrees, they're improving upon over the waterfall folks in terms of getting better security or risk outcomes. But their primary focus is productivity. And these are the folks that sort of eschew AppSec and other folks and see them as just, the Department of No and a tax on development that just slows us down. So there's that. If we move to the upper left, we get to what we call the security first SecOps. This probably looks a lot like the kinds of companies I work for. I'm guessing, financial services. I was in the insurance industry. I like to call them the most paranoid of the most paranoid and very, risk averse cultures. So these are the kinds of cultures that put quality and security first, and they understand that they're doing it at the expense of productivity and speed of delivery. But they're okay with that, right? Because they are prioritizing these outcomes, these risk management outcomes, over the productivity aspects. Okay, and then obviously the last one to the upper right is what we dub DevSecOps, the high performers. These are the folks that seem to have figured it out. They can get comparable, if not better, risk management outcomes, and they are comparable, if not better, in terms of productivity and delivery speed. Now, obviously, these dots are all over the place. And so in a minute, we'll take a look at how they aggregate. But first, let's just sort of pick them apart a little bit and do some compare and contrast. So the easiest thing for us to look at to really tease out what are some of the things that folks are doing is you look at the high performers to the low performers, right? So you have the biggest delta and the most contrast, right? So it makes things easier to spot and see. And so when we dig into them, here's what we see that we compare when we compare them. They're definitely deploying more frequently, a lot more frequently. To me, this is the next bit of key, though: faster detection of vulnerable OSS components. And I forgot to mention, I should mention one more thing. These security first folks, they have a lot of security practices, but they do tend to be manual and slow, which is part of why it's attacks. They're not necessarily automated, right? We'll touch on that in a second. But there's faster detection of vulnerable OSS components, faster remediation, 5.7 less time required for developers to be productive when switching teams. That's a huge thing for anyone that's worked in a large enterprise. The ability to reallocate resources and quickly be productive is a really big deal. And you don't want to be on that team that doesn't want to add resources because it'll just slow you down even more for a month or more before they get up to speed, right? You want to be on the team that can add resources in a matter of days or a week. You've got a new contributing member. It doesn't detract too long, and in fact then becomes additive relatively quickly. and 26 times less time to approve a no OSS dependency for use. The next one we want to look at was these two groups. So now, what are the high performers doing that the security first folks aren't doing? And when we did this comparison, the first thing that jumped out at us, obviously, as a SCA company, is that they were much more likely to be used software composition analysis and really have a program around this, right? They were also much more likely to have automated the approval management and analysis of dependencies, right? So so the security first teams maybe had a process, but it was probably manual, probably ticket-based, probably not automated, maybe not even centralized, sort of databases and warehouses of all of them, so they can easily understand when they discover something in one, all the other places it's affected, all that sort of stuff. And because they're doing a lot more automation, you also see the shift left starting to kick in, where there's 28% more likely to enforce this governance back in CI and earlier in the dev phase, and more importantly in that construct phase, right? Versus testing or even acceptance, right? So if you think about your SDLC, you're seeing it really push over into the construct phase. 51% more likely to maintain a software bill of materials, a direct byproduct of the fact that they have automated SCA analysis and more likely to have those tooling. So those all sort of go together. And 96% more likely to have that centrally scan all deployed artifacts for security and license compliance. This is another big one. So not only do they have the program on the front end, right? You need this program to scan these things, to approve, to manage them. You need that management and visibility needs to extend all the way into production. And so that's a glaring notice that the security first teams are doing all those scans somewhere in the middle of the life cycle, but then not again near the end, and they have no ongoing or updated visibility in that until the next release comes out. And remember, they're releasing a lot less frequency, so they have much bigger windows between those. But the other thing is, when we looked at these, we noticed one of the things, that we uncovered was that the productivity first group was much faster of approving open source license. I hinted at this earlier and I gave it away. What we found is that while they were a lot faster, about 75% of them had no formal open source approval process. So it literally was the developers were free to choose and use whatever they wanted. And I'm largely in favor of that, but it has to be done against a backdrop of at least a quick litmus test that says, is this okay? And you need to find that out right at the very beginning, right? You don't want to start going through your whole proof of concept, proof of technology, your minimal viable product. You don't want to get too deep into this process and then find out, oh my gosh, we chose the wrong thing, right? That would not be beneficial to anyone. And you also notice that there's a lot of overlap, right? If you look closely, you're like, well, those productivity first guys, a lot of them claim that and maybe have practices, but they don't look a whole lot better than some, there's an orange dot way over here to the left and up, there's waterfall teams doing a better job than them in both dimensions of risk outcomes and deployment frequency. And the blues, and the orange also kind of goes up into into the upper left. So it's hard to really tease too much. So we asked Stephen in particular, I think, to help us find the centroids on these things. And this is the part I sort of really like, because to me, this is a little bit of a roadmap in that I think most of us here could probably self-assess to some degree, probably almost intuitively or instinctively know if you work in a productivity first organization, a security first organization, or if you're still stuck in a waterfall organization. But it just gives you an idea that even if you're in those and you think you're doing really well, you can do better, right? There is still room for growth. You can get to better risk management outcomes, even if you're productivity first, right? You can achieve that risk management outcome improvement without slowing yourself down. And if you're a security first, you can still go faster and maintain those risk management outcomes, right? So there's a path forward for both of those groups. I happen to think the productivity first team, because they're already automating and doing a lot of things, has a much shorter path. I think their path to make the next jump is going to be a lot easier, a lot shorter, a lot less steep than going from this really security first mentality and trying to automate all of that and change a lot of that culture all the way into high performing. I think you've got a steeper hill to climb, but it's doable. We know it's doable because we have teams out there, and not the least of which, to some extent, even more recently, the federal government. Anyone familiar with things like Platform One and stuff, even these guys are getting good at going fast and maintaining really strict security and quality measures. And the reason you want to do all this is because you can get that better. You can get faster outcomes, better risk management, higher developer productivity. But probably key amongst all of them is that improved job satisfaction. We're in a really tough labor market. Good folks are hard to find, as it were. And so when you create that culture of learning and allow the whole organization to together make its way into that high performing group, you end up with a lot of folks that are really happy and want to stay in that job, right? So you can start to minimize your churn or be more selective about where that turnover is coming from, right? As opposed to having them disappear on you to go off to some cooler company that's a high performing company and is going to give them that happier place to work in. So my last bit here then is some guidance for the enterprise. Prioritize software supply chain and OSS management, right? Obviously that's a little self-serving coming from Sonatype, but we see just a stark differences in the companies that have embraced that versus not, right? There's a big difference. And it represents a massive opportunity if you're not really investing in here in the way you can. If you're already investing there, right, then it's really just about looking to automate more of your other security practices around it. Definitely, again, we saw that from the earlier feedback that we had to some of those teams. Move that stuff into CI, right? This stuff has to be fast. It has to be developer friendly. When I think about DevOps and feedback, to me, it's just like in the military and the whole team of teams and the small team stuff. It's about getting the right information to the right people at the right time. And those are the things I focus on. And traditionally, we used to get information to the security folks late, and then it got to the developers even later. And what we're seeing is you can give them this information right to the developers very early, so that you're giving them the right feedback at the right time while they're still constructing it, not later when they got to go pull a ticket, kind of go back, try and get their head back in that space, all the context switching stuff, right? We want to move that over there and make it very developer friendly, developer centric. We want to turn all of them into our security and quality champions. Even though they're still really focused on features, this stuff should not be taking up too much of their time. It should just be a little bit of their daily work on a regular basis, a part of that culture. And that's what's going to move that needle. Scan all those deployed artifacts for security and license compliance, and make sure you're tracking them into production. There's massive gains to be had in terms of your ability to respond to a 0-day. I don't know if anyone here has dealt with this, but if you've ever been at a company that got a 0-day notice, and then you start seeing emails like, hey, is anybody using this version of Struts or Spring or whatever that looks like? And we've talked to companies that can spend 30 days in discovery just finding out what the impact is of this new vulnerability. Whereas if you've scanned all of your deployed artifacts, that means you know what every one of them's using. And the minute you can then ask the reverse lookup, when you ask the reverse lookup there, who's using Struts, you will get a list of all the apps using it, right? So you immediately go out of discovery and right into prioritizing and remediation and mitigating. So there's massive gains to be had on the back end of this process. Because even if we do everything well, we're still going to have a really nice app, and we're still going to come in on a Monday and there's going to be the new remote code execution du jour, and we're going to have to cope with it, right? Or whatever that looks like. And this last one is a quote I put in, and this is really important, and it's hard. I mean, I think it's hard for a lot of us that have been in this job for a long time, but an organization's journey to excellence begins once it ceases to sacrifice quality for speed. And I feel like this is sort of a rewording of a lot of what Deming used to say. This is Neil Beiersdorf, who's an operational excellence guy. You can find him on LinkedIn. And this was one of the very first infographics he shared. And then since then, he's done a lot of quotes of a lot of other people. And I feel like this one is Deming-esque. But I like it because it just sort of really gets to the point. And it's, stop sacrificing one thing for the other. We don't have to. We live in an age where we can have we can have good, fast, and cheap, if you will. We can break the golden triangle because this is software, it's not physical. And if done well, it's easy to adjust and adapt. And once we get the automation and turn all these tools that typically generate reports and require people to sift through them to provide late feedback, if we can turn those into automated go, no go decisions, now you're really cooking with gas, right? So I'll leave you with this. I think we've covered that faster is better in virtually all cases. It's better for us. It's better for the adversary, sadly. It's better for open source projects. We know that faster is more secure, definitely. And we know that faster can be happier too. And with that, I'd like to thank everyone for listening to me today. And I haven't paid close attention to where we are on the time. Hopefully I haven't gone too bad. Richard and crew, do you want to open it up to, or is there questions already?
Yeah, this is Cassio. Richard had to step out, so
Okay.
I'll take the questions and help with the raffle. So let's see what we have.
Oh, and I can't. I guess I can. I just have to go here. Oh, there are a couple things in chat. Okay, I found it. Oh, that's the Grubhub time check. 3:55. Yeah. So we're coming up on the hour. It's the first time I gave this talk. I was a little unsure about how long it would go, and it's a big deck, but
No, that was good. Thanks so much, Curtis. For some reason, I'm not seeing questions. Yeah, I see some kudos. Yeah, great presentation. What advisements for developers doing design stuff?
Design stuff?
Designing stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. The design time is fine when it's just conceptual, but when you start to do some coding, right, to do that minimal viable product, or maybe just a proof that the technology will even work, whatever that looks like. That's why I was suggesting we want to, if we have a process in place that can help inform us of which projects are going to be the right kinds of projects to help us enable that, that would be ideal. Because otherwise you end up with that, and we've all seen it. It starts out as a proof of concept, and then a couple months later it's in production, right? It's never anybody's intent to do that, but it happens. So that's why it's so important to have a process so that upfront you're making these strategic choices early, right? And it's somewhere right after design and right at the very beginning of implementation is when it begins, and then you got to live with it from there on.
Okay, very good. A lot of kudos going on in chat as well. And another question from Bill. So are there ratings of open source components?
Yeah, obviously that's something we're working on. We've introduced hygiene ratings in our product. We're starting to get proactive in our ability to detect upstream attacks like malicious code. We're starting to flag projects as suspicious. If there was any kind of unusual activity about the most recent commit, a lot of times it's just the very first time you see a project at its first version, that all by itself is suspicious because it's brand new. This is something that, based on the data you saw today, this is the type of learning that's informed us now to work on solutions. So it's the sort of thing that we have some stuff today, and I think in the coming months and 2021, we'll see more announcements coming out of Sonatype, helping our customers answer those questions.
Okay. Other questions? Going once, going twice. Okay, so the next thing is Samir. Let me see if I can unmute you. We're going to do the raffle.
Perfect.
Oh, right.
Yes. Oh, you unmute yourself. Great. So the way we can do this is I have Excel here. I can generate a random number, and whoever is the person with that number wins. If there is
Has the code been checked for weaknesses with randomness?
And we use Black Duck. We're okay.
just couldn't resist.
Casio, 1 to 28.
I'm sorry, what? 1 is 28?
1 to 28. We have 28 people
Yes.
filled on the list.
Sure. Let me go and do Rand.
I feel like we have to do math now.
Yeah.
In between. Come on, computer. Let me take my camera off.
Okay.
So I can see if this goes a little bit faster. Between, a little bit better. Make this bigger. Sharing my screen. Screen number 1. So press F9. Can everybody see my screen? I hope so.
Not yet, Casio. It's black.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh, there it
we
is.
go.
Okay, I'll press F9 5 times and then whatever number goes. 1,
Cool.
2, 3, 4, 5.
Number
21.
6, Greg Williams.
Yay, Greg.
Awesome. $50 Amazon gift card. And then one more, Casio.
There he is. Woo.
Congratulations. Second, ready for the second one?
Yep.
Okay, 5 more times. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Do you still have an F9 key?
Don Win.
Number 9.
Don Win.
Don. Congratulations, Don.
Congratulations, Don.
Awesome.
Yeah.
I will send you guys the gift certificates as soon as this call is over. So thank you guys. And Curtis, great presentation. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you,
Curtis,
Samir.
once again, on behalf of OWASP, great presentation. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, everyone, for coming out. Thanks for having us.
Yes.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, Casio.
Mhm.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, Amir.